you're so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Ladies and gentlemen, Lula is back. The former Brazilian president who served for 2 terms and was later put in jail under spurious corruption charges by the right-wing government, achieved, I would say, not miraculous, but an amazing victory that had me a bit worried last night. When I went to sleep last night, I was definitely worried because this has happened in Brazil. It's also happened in the US that whenever there's an election with a fascist running, the fascist tends to have much more support than what the polls would suggest. Because I guess there's an effect of people being somewhat embarrassed or just unwilling to say that they're going to support the fascists. So this ends up giving the fascists that sort of invisible boost in the end, which is a couple of percentage points, maybe like 5%. So it's worrying, like when polls are very close right before the election, and there's a fascist running, especially if it's the incumbent, who obviously benefits from the ability, especially in a country like Brazil or Latin America in general, where there's a lot of ways in which the incumbent can use dodgy tactics to win. In Mexico, this happens all the time, whether it's left or right, they all do it. I presume Brazil is not much different. So the result was incredibly close, like incredibly close. 50.9 versus 49.10. That is just wow. Um, Brazil tends to have very good reporting on its elections, so it's all updated. This is the final result. Um, yeah, this is very close for, I mean, too close for comfort, I would say. I mean, the fact that 49% of the country thinks that Bolsonaro is preferable to a guy who already, like, the people who voted for Bolsonaro surely are aware that life got better under Lula, and are surely aware that he was jailed for spurious reasons. That's not to say that there wasn't corruption under the Workers' Party. And I think a lot of leftist commentators have tried to downplay that a lot. I remember Michael Brooks, who was very much, was commented a lot on Brazilian politics. Would I say, in my personal view, was way too tolerant of some of the corruption that did take place. That's not to say that there isn't corruption under Bolsonaro. Quite the contrary, they're even worse. Like they will always the single common denominator of modern right-wing fascism is just how corrupt they are. So, this was not an improvement in any way in the rule of law. But still, there were some worrying aspects of corruption under the Workers' Party. But, I mean, by and large, they got the job done, at least under Lula. Dilma made some mistakes, to put it kindly. But at least under Lula, the country reduced poverty massively, reduced inequality massively. The economy grew at an impressive rate. So, hopefully we can see a repeat of that under version 2 of Lula. Now, one of the main reasons that I think voting for, like, even if you were sort of on the fence, which I struggle to imagine someone being on the fence when Bolsonaro is the alternative. But the main reason I would say to support Lula, not just as a Brazilian, maybe less so as a Brazilian, but more as a sort of citizen of the world, is obviously for environmental reasons. Bolsonaro did not give a hoot about the Amazon, whereas Lula contributed to a rather significant decrease in deforestation. So I would say just on that basis alone, Lula was worth your vote. Or if you're not Brazilian, was worth your support. But there were millions of other reasons for why Lula was better than, like, I can't think of a single reason in which Bolsonaro was better than Lula, like, at all. Uh, so I'm glad he's gone. And I saw a tweet that I found really funny, which was basically now Bolsonaro can dedicate himself to do what his favorite pastime, which is catching COVID and going to the hospital. So yeah, maybe he'll get COVID again. Anyway, now what does this mean? Well, it means this, and I know this map is gonna have a few caveats, so I'm gonna go through them. But basically, this is the American continent in terms of whether they have a left of center or right of center government. And the caveat that I would make, obviously, when you see the US as red, or perhaps even Canada as red, is are these all really left-wing governments? The answer is obviously no. Are they even left of center governments? Well, obviously no either. I would just say, are they leftier than the baseline for their respective countries? Then yes. So if you take the baseline of the US as being essentially center right, well, or maybe even sort of like more to the right than center right, then yeah, the Democrats are to the left of whatever that baseline is. Though by standards that you and I assume the viewers of this channel will definitely agree that the Democratic Party is not a left-wing party by any stretch of the imagination. But also definitely think Trudeau's Canada is not a left-wing government by any stretch of the imagination. But still, it's kind of stunning how, if you see this more as like each country's traditional right-wing parties are currently not in office, that is quite a shocking result, I would say. And I loved some of the comments here. I mean, I think this map is sort of like partly in jest. Yes, I'm including the Democrats and the Communist Party of Cuba in the same category. You know, that's the caveat I was mentioning. The Americas is not a continent. It is the giant left-wing island of the human race. It is now called the left hemisphere. Pink tide Biden. Yeah, that is kind of funny. Yeah, so I mean the fundamental problem here, and this is the problem of leftist politics in general, is that right-wing governments tend to always be right-wing. Like every government that is identified as right-wing will not surprise you with how left-wing they are, right? Whereas a lot of the governments that are left-wing will surprise you at how right-wing they are. So there's a problem that just by their self-identification as left-wing parties or left-wing governments does not mean that they're enacting right-wing policy, left-wing policies, which is really a shame. So you can understand like the default in this day and age, in the default under neoliberal capitalism is to be right-wing. And it takes a lot of effort for a government to be like truly left-wing, even if they self-identify. And some of the times it's because they really weren't as left as they campaigned. And I would say the example of Mexico is the best one. I mean, yeah, AMLO, everyone would assume that AMLO is a left-wing president, but in practice he governs like a right-wing one. We've had austerity for 4 years. We've had our military expand in terms of its role in society in ways that are, quite frankly, unfathomable. He is socially conservative. So I'm really, aside from some either token or, I would say there's been a few good things in terms of like raising minimum wages, things like that AMLO has done, which would definitely be categorized as left-wing policies. But aside from that, and this is like a handful of stuff, almost everything else by AMLO and his party have been right-wing. So is it fair to categorize Mexico as a left-wing government? The answer is no. By no stretch of the imagination is Mexico under AMLO a left-wing government. And I'm probably going to make, I've been promising to make a video on Mexico in English. So, because I think a lot of Western leftists are fooled by Mexico. And especially if you read Jacobin, which their Mexico writer is basically just a propagandist of the government. you'll get a false impression of what's actually going on. Anyway, what other countries I would say, like Nicaragua is left, but it's pretty much a dictatorship again. So, is this really the kind of leftism that we want? Honduras seems to be a more legit left-wing government right now under Xiomara Castro. I don't know much about Panama. What else? Colombia under Petro. I think there's a lot of promise there. Colombia is one of the countries that I'm most eager to see succeed. Hopefully it will. Venezuela, come on, Venezuela is not the kind of leftism that you would want. Peru, Castro seems to have just been a dud. He was sort of painted as the South American AMLO, and then he just sort of disappeared off the face of the earth. And I haven't followed Peru very well, but I think it's just been, yeah, a bit of a disappointment. Bolivia, clearly a left-wing government, done a lot of good stuff. I hate their rhetoric sometimes. They're a bit tanky-ish on their foreign policy, but by and large, I think they've done a pretty good job. Chile, under Boric, yep, left-wing. Argentina, clearly left-wing. Yeah, that just leaves Uruguay, Paraguay, Ecuador. Ecuador is like a super neoliberal government right now under the former left-wing party, which is a bit bizarre. Yeah, so there you go. That's the pink tide, which I would say is I don't know if this is a more I mean, it's definitely a more substantive tide than the first pink tide, which was in the 2000s, sort of like late 90s, 2000s. I would say that at the time they were more legitimately left-wing governments in power, versus now where you have a lot of left-wing governments that identify as left but govern as right, like the Mexico case, or are full-blown authoritarian, which at the time, for example, Venezuela really wasn't. I mean, it wasn't, Hugo Chavez was not that committed to democracy, I must say, but he wasn't a dictator the way that the current guy is. So, elections in Venezuela were won, free and fairly. Well, maybe not fairly, because obviously the government put in a lot of money on there was a lot of cronyism. There was a lot of what do you call the term when you basically just give money for stuff and get votes, patronage, basically. So I wouldn't call them entirely fair, but they were, he won fair and square, I would say, in a sense. He didn't lock up the opposition the way Maduro does. So it was definitely a different form of Chavismo under Chavez than under Maduro. So I would say the first wave of the pink tide was much more legitimately leftist than the current one, where there's so many countries that deserve a little asterisk next to them on whether how leftist they are. But yeah, well, I hope Lula succeeds. And I think given his record in his first 2 terms in office, I think he can repeat the success. International conditions are not as good as they were back then, and that was another reason why the pink tide was so successful, because Latin America, especially South America, especially because most of these countries are commodity exporters, did very well during the pre-crisis commodity boom, and so that helped sustain their economies, and that helped sustain them. If their economies are booming, their leaders will be reelected. So Mexico was the odd man out here because we are not a commodity exporter, we're a manufacturing exporter. But yeah, like now I think the situation is a bit different. I don't think that the next decade is going to be, or what's left of this decade is going to be booming. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to get things done, and there's no guarantee that they will get the things done. And there's also a lot of pressure from, Latin America is very conservative, very socially conservative, politically. I would say the gravitation towards the right is in many ways much stronger. These are all countries that remain very unequal. You have very powerful elites. You have a lot of racial stratification as well. And, you know, economic power is related to that racial stratification. And so these people, you know, elites don't want to lose those privileges. So they will always do everything they can to avoid, you know, tax reforms or things like that. So, and then this impairs the ability of these countries to make the policies that they want. Because if they don't have revenues, they can't get things done. So we'll see. We'll see. But I mean, let's be honest. Whatever their faults and whatever the caveats we can give to these countries and governments, it's still better that they're red than they're blue. Except in some cases, Venezuela and Nicaragua probably. But the other ones, yeah, definitely. So yeah, on that note, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe, and I will see you next time.